Hey, welcome everybody to the College 12-Pack, a new podcast with myself, senior editor of the College Wire's Patrick Conn. Along with me each and every week will be Tyler Nettuno of LSU Tigers Wire, breaking down 12 topics each and every week. You know, the emphasis is obviously going to be football, but we'll talk basketball, we'll talk baseball, and whatever sports comes up. But first off, Tyler, excited about this new project. And not to dive right into it, but I do want to dive right into it. Talking about the SEC schedule, we finally found out they're going to go with 8 games versus 9 games. Some teams wanted 9. One team in particular, the Texas Longhorns, wanted 9, but they didn't get a vote because they're not active members yet. What was your thoughts when you heard that we're going with 8 games versus the 9?
Yeah, so when the SEC spring meetings got underway in Destin, Florida last week, this was like one of the bigger topics of discussion. And it was really interesting to me because Greg Sankey, the commissioner, was hinting that a decision could be made as far as future scheduling this week. Ultimately, it was obviously, at least in the short term. They're going to be eliminating divisions when Texas and Oklahoma join, sticking at 8. What really interested me about that was that it seemed, he never said it publicly, but just from just the general vibe, it seemed like Sankey wanted it to expand to 9 games. Obviously, it ended up not doing that. There was pushback from several schools, it seems. And like I said, this is probably going to be a temporary solution. It seems more likely than not they're probably going to end up at 9 games, if not after 2024 in the relatively near future. But I think, to me, the main takeaway here is that, Sankey is a guy that I think a lot of people view as one of the most powerful people in this sport. He's a guy who operates in the shadows. The whole negotiation to bring Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC from the Big 12, that seemed to have even blindsided the Big 12 when it happened. So I think it's a bit telling to me that Sankey wasn't able to get his way on this one, at least in the short term, it seems.
Yeah, and to me, it speaks to the cowardice of some of the teams, that were voting, going with 8 games so they can get their extra easy win in November, October. Scheduling a UMass or UAB or directional school university. Put them in there. Southeastern Louisiana. They are obviously the SEC is they have. When people look at the SEC as a whole, it's the number one conference in all of college football. They produced, so many national champions over the years. It has been, whether it was LSU, Georgia twice, Alabama. When you look at, just in recent memory, they are the very top. And to think that, they want to go with an 8 just so they can get, 3 extra games. They are going to play a Power 5, but who's to say that Power 5 opponent's not going to be the bottom tier? They won't, obviously not play on the schedule. They could play Vanderbilt, but they can't go and schedule Vanderbilt outside of that. Maybe in recent years it would have been a Kansas, but how often are we actually going to get to see them play an Ohio State, a Michigan, those teams, a USC? So I look at it and think they kind of failed when they could have went with 9 games, and then gone with the 3 non-conference, and you don't really need to have that extra Power 5 game because you're getting that with that extra SEC game.
Yeah, especially considering that the move to 9 games is something that other leagues like the Big Ten, which, seems to be is shaping up to kind of be in its own tier along with the SEC. That's a move they've already made. So it was a bit surprising to see the SEC not follow suit.
Absolutely. But now we're going to get into our top quarterbacks that I ranked on College Sports Wire. You can check that out, collegesportswire.usatoday.com. Tyler, just looking it over, you're going with Caleb Williams at number 1. Drake May at number 2. Is there really an argument to be made for either one of those not being 1 or 2, 1 and 2 in that spot?
No, I don't think so. I think I would pretty much entirely agree with that. Caleb Williams is a guy that, could have been the first overall pick this year if he was draft eligible. I expect he's going to have another big year this year. And Drake May burst onto the scene, looked like one of the best quarterbacks in the country as well. I think those two are pretty clearly, maybe you could argue it's a 1A, 1B thing, but I would personally stick with the way you rank them, going Williams 1 and then May 2.
Yeah, you look at him, and the argument I think you could make, Michael Penix Jr., who really burst onto the scene in that offense. And I know we're going to talk about KALEN DEBOER in here in a little bit, but when you look at what he did with that set of wide receivers he has in Rome, Odunze, you talk about McMillan, they have a lot of talent there. But how much of that offense is predicated on the talented trio of wide receivers if you throw Polk in there as well, and how much of that is Michael Penix Jr. I think we're not really going to get an answer with all three of those wide receivers returning, but there is an argument to be made of Penix Jr. Being in one of those top two, and I think he's going to be in strong consideration for the Heisman by the time the season ends.
I totally agree with that. And so looking at the way you round out the top five with Sam Hartman, then Michael Penix, then JJ McCarthy, I think that, you could maybe dispute the order of those guys. I think that it's fair to say that the way you've got the top five is probably the best five. I think if there's one guy that I would say maybe could be pushing into that is the guy you have at 6, which is Bo Nix from Oregon, who we kind of memed this guy into becoming a legitimately very good quarterback. His tenure at Auburn was not great, had a lot of ups and downs, but he goes to Oregon, has a huge year with Dan Lanning. And I mean, it's easy to forget that this is a guy who was a 5-star prospect coming out of high school. All of a sudden he's gone to Oregon, and now he's probably going to have a year where he could see himself, play his way into being a first-round pick in the draft.
Yeah, he's got a new offensive coordinator. He's having fun, as he said. I'm not going to read off the whole meme. But you're right. The only question I have for him is how does he look this year without Kenny Dillingham there, who's now the new head coach of Arizona State. But I still think he's talented enough. He's got plenty of weapons around him with Troy Franklin. But he was one of those guys who he can run it in, he can throw it, he can even catch a couple. So that's definitely going to be somebody to watch this year. He's one of probably my favorite quarterbacks to watch this year outside of the big three that everybody's talking about. Really, but looking at those rankings, I want to get into our next topic, and that is who's too high on this list? Who did you look at and go, okay, I don't understand the ranking there. Why do you have, maybe why would you justify putting this guy there?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to stick within the state of Oregon for this one. My choice was DJ Uyunglele. Sorry, got it right that time. He, a guy that former 5-star also starts his career off at Clemson, has a pretty tough task replacing Trevor Lawrence. I mean, being the next guy up in that's a pretty tough situation to put him in. He looks good at times early on, but really just never has it. Especially this past season just didn't go very well for him. He's ultimately supplanted. I think going to Oregon State is a much better fit for him. I think, going out back to the West Coast, he's a California kid. Jonathan Smith is, I think, building a really solid program in Corvallis. They won 10 games this year, beat Florida in a bowl game. Like they've definitely got a good trajectory. The Pac-12 seems, relatively open. I think he's poised to have a good year. But looking at some of the guys that are ranked, shortly behind him on the list, I think a lot of them have proven a lot more than DJ has. And DJ is a guy that started a lot of games at this point in his career. I'm just I think it's going to be better this year with Oregon State. I'm a little skeptical about how big of a leap he's prepared to take this year.
Yeah, a lot of it, there's the upside, and we know that. I mean, a lot of the upside is tied to this guy was a 5-star recruit out of the West Coast. He's going back to the West Coast, obviously not California where he was at, obviously, but going into Corvallis. You look at what you said Jonathan Smith is doing. He's really building that. But a lot of why I am high on him is because he's no longer going to have to be dealing with Brandon Streeter's offense. And that was my big question. I mean, he was still a lot more productive. Everybody wanted to talk about, Cade Klubnik. And I'm a big Cade guy being in the state of Texas. But Cade didn't do anything that made me think that he was that he was going to take that offense to a new level. And we saw the production on the field. It wasn't really what we expected. But you talk about a guy with DJ, alphabet soup. I'm not even going to try and, butcher that name. You look at what he can do. I mean, you get in the red zone, and he can run the football for you. He can throw. I think that they're really building something like you said. And I'm just going off the upside here with DJ. I think he's going to have a phenomenal year, in Corvallis.
Yeah, I mean, I would just point out there is a little bit of precedent for guys that, have a lot of experience, but maybe not all of it good coming in. One thing that I thought, when kind of thinking about this segment, like what's the upside here for DJU? I think, maybe could he be this year's Jaden Daniels? I mean, a guy that had ups and downs at a Power 5 school, transfers, and just seems to look a lot better. Like, I think the potential is there. I'm not sure I'm buying into that, but I could see that happening.
Could he be this year's Bo Nix? Big question.
Ooh, there you go. Even better one.
Let's talk about, we've gone too high. Who's too low for you on this list? Who is somebody you see as a potential fringe top 10 quarterback for the upcoming season?
Yeah, so this is a guy that, and another one of those guys that I think you had behind DJ that I would be a little bit more high on is Michael Pratt from Tulane. This is a guy who led Tulane to one of their best seasons in program history last year. They win 12 games for, I believe, the second time ever, beat USC in the Cotton Bowl. And he does lose some pieces. Like, I'm not saying they're exactly running it back with the whole unit. They lose one of the best running backs in Tyjae Spears. He loses I think is like top two leading receivers both graduated, so they're moving on. So there's going to be some transition here, but at the same time, he could have entered the transfer portal and would have gotten significant interest. I mean, this is a guy that would almost certainly be a Power 5 starter right now if he had opted to do that. He didn't. He's coming back, so keeping continuity within this team. Same thing with his coach, Willie Fritz, who was deep into negotiations with Georgia Tech. At one time, looked like he was leaving to go there. A little unclear whether that was his choice or Georgia Tech's choice, but regardless, he's coming back too. I mean, this is a good team that's, poised, I think, to be the favorite in an American that loses, three of its best programs in UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston to the Big 12.
Yeah, well, when you look at it as a whole, like as you talked about what he's losing, that was my big question. Losing Tyjae Sharp, who really USC's got to be ecstatic that he's no longer in college football. After what he did to them, in the Cotton Bowl. They are a team that is trending in the right direction. And like you said, three big-time teams are leaving the American. So that gives them kind of the edge. But again, when you lose that level of production, not just your running back, but your top two receivers, that's where I'm looking at this going, I don't know. Like, I'm a believer in Pratt. I just don't know if he, for me, he's top 15. Top 10, I mean, there's only 10 spots. Somebody's got to be on the outside. And that's why I have Pratt there. But as we dive into more, we're heading to our next topic here. We're talking about head coach rankings. And here, me and Tyler are going to have a little argument. Who is the number one head coach in college football? Tyler, I know that you're a graduate of the University of Florida, and you're probably going to get a lot of hate for this, but I'm Team Nick Saban. I know you're going Team Kirby here. Why would you put Kirby Smart over Nick Saban as the number one head coach in college football?
Yeah. So look, to be clear, for like the purposes of this discussion, this isn't a lifetime achievement award. If it were, it would be Nick Saban because he's the greatest college football coach of all time. I don't think that's disputable even. But it's not a lifetime achievement award. And if we're talking about which of these two coaches I think is best poised to win college football games in 2023, I think it's Kirby Smart. I mean, he's won back-to-back titles. He's recruited more consistently. I mean, not that Alabama hasn't recruited extremely well over the last 5 or so years, but he has recruited more consistently. And I mean, he could be poised to win a third straight title this year. I mean, obviously that's easier said than done, but I don't think there's a clear team that's ready to challenge them this year. I think everyone else has a lot more questions, or at least as many questions as they do. I mean, look, I think, he's a guy I look at, I think is sort of setting the terms of how college football is played these days. We've seen Nick Saban innovate before. He did, when he moved to a more modern offense back around 2015 when he hired Lane Kiffin. He's doing that again this year, bringing in Tommy Rees. But I think it's pretty clear he's playing catch up. He's trying to match the kind of things that Kirby's doing, running 12 personnel with 2 tight end sets, a more pro-friendly type of offense, moving away from the spread that we've seen. He's trying to play catch up with Kirby. So I think this is the first time really since Saban got things moving at Alabama. It doesn't feel to me like he's at the cutting edge of the sport anymore. And that's why I would say Kirby's number one right now.
Now, I'm going to sound a little bit hypocritical here. In most of my rankings that I've done this offseason, they are not lifetime achievement. But I gave Nick Saban the number one spot because of what he has done. We have not seen a head coach that has won 10 or more games this many times. I'm talking 15 straight years. You talk about the recruiting. You talk about the guys that he puts in the NFL, the development, everything that he does. So it's going to sound hypocritical. But I'm going to have Nick Saban at the top because he is the best. He has proven to be the best coach of all time, and it's hard for me to put anybody else there. Now, I will tell you this. If Kirby Smart wins a third straight title, I will put him number one next year. Because,
enough.
I mean, when you look at just the college football dominance and how, it's been since 1936 that a head coach and a team have won 3 straight titles. I mean, that's something that we just don't see. It's not the NFL where we see, 3 out of 4 years you're winning championships. Or, it's not the Dallas Cowboys of the 90s or the New England Patriots from 2000 on. Really, it's not something that we see. It goes in spurts. But the fact that these two head coaches have proven that they can consistently win, I don't think you can go wrong with either coach at number one. I see arguments for both. But for now, Nick Saban's my number one. And I guess Kirby Smart is your number one. But let's talk about other coaches. Let's talk about who's more overrated. Jimbo Fisher or James Franklin. Jimbo Fisher is living off of a national championship that he won a decade ago. When was the last time he coached a consensus All-American quarterback? That was 2013, and that was Jameis Winston. Since then, we haven't seen it. The offense has fallen off in recent years, especially since 2020. Just looking at everything that Jimbo Fisher has done, is he a good offensive coach? Absolutely. You're not going to hear me say he's not. But I don't think that he is at the level that the media loves to put him at. Top 25 head coach, I'm not. He barely made my top 30. And that, frankly, because what really has Jimbo Fisher done since 2013? We're talking about a decade later, constantly having to hear about what he's done in the past. But, that old scout mentality is, if I see it once, he can do it again. Okay, well, that may be true. But for me, I'm like, what have you done for me lately? And looking at Jimbo Fisher, that's why I think he's more overrated than James Franklin right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that you just said. I think of all the coaches that are on this list, Jimbo is probably one of the toughest ones to evaluate just because there aren't that many active coaches in college football with national titles. With that being said, he really hasn't been able to match that success since 2013. I mean, we've seen it a little bit. They went back to the playoff the next year, had an Orange Bowl run in 2016, I believe. But they haven't been the consistently dominant program that they were about a decade ago. Either of his teams, at Florida State or Texas A&M. So I think I don't really. The reason I wouldn't say he's overrated per se is because I think where you have him on the list is pretty fair. I'm not sure he is a top 25 coach in college football right now. But the reason the ranking of James Franklin stuck out to me a little bit is because you have him at number 9, I believe. And I mean, I'm not anti James Franklin. I think he's a very good football coach, but I think he's also a guy that's a little tough to evaluate and for me to call a top 10 coach right now. I mean, you can't discount the fact that, first of all, just looking at his career as a whole, winning back-to-back 9-win seasons at Vanderbilt, that's really hard to do and something that no one else has really been able to do. And then he goes to Penn State and, wins the Big Ten in 2016 when Urban Meyer's at Ohio State. That's another thing that's not easy to do. So he's, I think, proven himself to a degree. But since then, it's kind of been, they've been behind. And, he had back-to-back really disappointing years in 2020 and 2021. They get back on track last year, win 11 games, win the Rose Bowl. And this is a really big year for James Franklin, I think, because this is a really talented team they have. It has a lot of potential. They lose Sean Clifford, their quarterback, but this is the first year they're going to be starting Drew Aller, who's a former 5-star, one of the best prospects they've landed in a long time. They've got a high ceiling this year. And I think the problem I have with James Franklin and this Penn State program is they've kind of just settled into, I think, like a tier of their own within the Big Ten, right? They're clearly, I think, better than the rest of the pack, but they still sit well behind Michigan and Ohio State, in my opinion. Will they close that gap this year? Maybe. I mean, Wisconsin's also probably going to be coming up on them with Luke Fickell. So, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, when you look at the Big Ten and look at, James Franklin and Penn State, I agree with everything that you said. But still, I think, the fact that he won 11 games last year with Sean Clifford as his quarterback speaks to his coaching ability. I'm not a guy who believes in Sean Clifford. Now, Drew Aller, I think he's going to be fantastic. He's got Nicholas Singleton. He's got, Cephas coming in at wide receiver. I mean, they have talent on both sides of the ball. But you're right. The big question this year for James Franklin, can he beat Ohio State? Can he beat Michigan? Can he beat both? Because he's going to have to beat both if he wants to play for a Big Ten title again. Especially with how talented those two football teams are. When you talk about Michigan returning both their running backs, their quarterback, They got talent on both sides of the ball, in Ohio State, who just, gets every 5-star wide receiver they can find. They're tough. But on the flip side of that, let's talk about some guys who maybe aren't getting enough love. Guys who are kind of under the radar. And one guy is coming into his second year that I want to talk about is the guy that you talked about a little bit earlier. You talked about Dan Lanning. The job that he did as a defensive coordinator, defensive staff at Georgia, part of that first national championship. The first national championship that they brought back to Athens in 40 years. And what did they had to, they had to get some stuff to fall their way, but defensively, really good football coach. Then you talk about what the job that he did last year, taking over from Mario Cristobal. Not an exactly easy with, the upheaval of the transfer portal and everything. The fact that he was able to, win the Holiday Bowl, was in contention late in the season for a Pac-12 title, which, for any coach in their first year to be in contention for any conference championship, I think it just shows you the level. I mean, you could talk about what he inherited, but he had to go get Bo Nix, a guy that nobody believed in. And what he was able to do offensively with Kenny Dillingham, bringing him over, a guy who coached Bo Nix at Auburn, and really the job that he did with Oregon. And I think is a large reason why you're looking at going into this year. Again, they added more talent through the transfer portal. I think they're poised for a Pac-12 title run.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, this might be the most attention the Pac-12 has gotten on a national college football show in a while. Because looking at the guy that I think is maybe poised to take the biggest leap on these lists, maybe next year, is another Pac-12 coach who we've talked about a little bit, and KALEN DEBOER at Washington. A guy that I think it's a little bit underrated because Washington has been a generally pretty consistent program. I think it's underrated the situation he walked into. They lose Chris Peterson, steps down, one of the more consistent coaches in college football for the last 2 decades. He's replaced, they try to keep that consistency up with a continuity hire in Jimmy Lake. It really does not work out for a number of reasons. And DeBoer, is a relatively unknown guy in college football. He took over at Fresno in 2020, turned it around quickly. Before that, he was the offensive coordinator at Indiana, so not like a big name guy. And he's really, increased his profile very quickly, with quick turnarounds at Fresno and now at Washington, winning 11 games last year. I mean, this was a team that at one point looked like it could have been a playoff contender, kind of, spoiled by a couple early losses to UCLA and Arizona State, but they ended the year winning 7 straight games. They probably cost their rival Oregon a spot in the playoff by upsetting them up in Eugene. I mean, I think just as much as Oregon, this is a team that's poised to potentially compete for a playoff spot this year.
I would absolutely love to see Oregon versus Washington in the Pac-12 title game. That would be a lot of fun to watch. Obviously, people are going to bring up USC, but nobody wants to see them win the Pac-12 the year they're leaving, right? But I do want to correct you on one thing. You were talking about that no college football show has talked about the Pac-12 this much. I'm going to correct you and say in a positive manner. Mostly we've been making jokes. We've been making jokes about their lack of a TV deal. Whether it's let's go streaming, Apple TV. At this point, they might want to go to Comedy Central because it's been a joke. Now let's get into.
Hey, I hear the CW might need a new property.
They might need a new property. You're absolutely right about that. Let's talk here. There's a new bowl game coming out this next year. No longer will we have the Cheez-It Bowl. Not to be confused with the Cheez-It Citrus Bowl, but no longer the Cheez-It Bowl. We're going to the Pop-Tart Bowl. What's your initial reaction to hearing Pop-Tarts becoming a sponsor for a bowl game in college football?
Yeah, so I'm not really someone who generally particularly cares much about, branding sponsorships and tie-ins with bowl games. But I will say when I heard this, I had one primary concern because I'm a huge fan of coaches having snacks dumped on them after winning bowl games. And I think the Cheez-It Bowl had one of the best where they filled the Gatorade tub full of Cheez-Its. So I don't really have a takeaway for this as much as a suggestion, which is Pop-Tart makes bite-sized Pop-Tarts that I think could be an easy replacement for the Cheez-Its. And this isn't product placement for Pop-Tarts. Again, this is just a guy who really likes seeing snacks dumped on coaches.
Now, the big question for me is, are you team Frosted or do you like the plain Pop-Tarts?
Oh, dude, Frosted. Who doesn't like Frosted?
We won't agree with that. I like the plain. But for me, what's interesting about Pop-Tarts is Pop-Tarts to me it goes with college. Let's be honest. The only two things they could have done, Pop-Tarts or ramen. I don't know how the ramen bowl game would work, but those two things are synonymous with college. Living in a dorm, you would know. You were in Gainesville.
Yeah, I'm gonna plead the fifth on how many boxes of Pop Tarts I went through in my 4 years in Gainesville.
My big question though is Pop-Tarts going to have a hotel designed, the way that the cheese room was, and give an NIL deal to one of the players. I believe
God,
Darren
I hope
Nussbaum
so.
was one of the guys that got that. That for me was interesting. I love the fact, get some new sponsors in there. That's good for both the game of college football and the Pop-Tarts brand. Now let's talk about players from yesteryear, no longer playing the game. The College Football Hall of Fame and the National Football Foundation released the ballot for the College Football Hall of Fame class of 2024. I am interested to see kind of who gets nominated, but one guy that I really wanted to point out, and yes, I am wearing my Texas Tech gear today. I'm going to point out Graham Harrell, probably the greatest quarterback that played for the legendary Mike Leach, rest in peace. Just when he left the game of football, I mean, he was the prototypical air raid quarterback, accurate, can get the ball down the field. He doesn't have the strongest arm, but he can make big plays. If you don't believe me, just ask the University of Texas back in 2008. They saw it. Just looking at what he was able to do, and he's very similar to Will Rogers, I think. Just the way that they play the game, the amount of balls that they throw, the way that they do things. They can win you some football games. Yeah, but I thought it was interesting with him being on there. Is he a guy to you who is kind of in that fringe, first ballot? While he never wanted a championship, he did lead them to a Pac-12 South co-championship year, the year that Texas, Oklahoma, and Tech all tied. But the fact that he never won a championship, does that kind of knock him down a little bit for you?
I mean, maybe a little bit, but I think when you look at, what he did relative to what Texas Tech had done before, and I mean, I'm always going to be a little biased on this because this was kind of the era within which I was sort of coming of age as like a sports fan. So I'll always sort of remember Graham Harrell as one of those electric college quarterbacks that was so much fun to watch that you kind of knew was never going to become a great NFL guy, but just an all-time college quarterback for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, when you look at what he was able to do, the other name that's interesting that's on this list, talking about quarterbacks, is the name that we've been waiting to get into the Hall of Fame is Mike Vick. What's your big takeaway about Mike Vick and his career at the collegiate level prior to going into the NFL and obviously being a huge name for them?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, a guy who's more remembered for what he did at the next level, and personally, maybe has a bit of a complicated legacy, but from a football perspective, was as transformational, I think, for the quarterback position at both the college and NFL levels as anybody in the last few decades has been. I mean, he's a guy that burst onto the scene as a true freshman, or not as a redshirt freshman. Sorry, and we've seen, we had seen quarterbacks who were athletic and could run the ball before, in the years preceding, like guys like Tommy Frazier and stuff. But I think what really made Vic unique was how he wasn't, just a runner. He was a guy that could, really sling it. He led the NCAA in passing efficiency as a freshman, set a record doing that. Finishes third in Heisman voting that year. Only the second freshman to ever do that at that time after Herschel Walker. And, that's a time when there was a lot of stigma around underclassmen with the Heisman Trophy. Had that happened now, maybe he wins it. But regardless, I think, he's a guy that I look at that I think really paved the way for what we've seen, what developed in college football in the 2000s with the guys that came through. And even after that, I think when you look at players like Lamar Jackson, who, regardless of what people who don't know ball say, he's a really good passer in addition to being a very good runner of the football. And I think Vic was kind of maybe not the original archetype for that, but I think he's kind of the guy that a lot of people would point to. I think even at the time, people saw how transformational of a player he was going to be.
I do find it funny about the revisionist history of Mike Vick. Not to say that he wasn't talented and didn't have, put his mark on the game. I find it funny talking about the revisionist history of, listening to some people talk about it And you would think the way they talked about Mike Vick dominating the game that he put up the numbers Lamar Jackson put up the year that he won the Heisman. Talented, and obviously the game has evolved. It's changed since the time of Mike Vick, prior to going to the NFL and being more pass heavy and more offensive heavy. Before it was more just don't let your quarterback lose you the football game. But we've seen that change. But ultimately, Mike Vick, one of the best ever. And I truly hope that he does get into the College Football Hall of Fame, and not to just bypass everybody else that's on this list, but I want him to get into the head coaches on this list. Two of them really stuck out to me when we talk about Frank Solich, who coached at Nebraska, went on to Ohio, and then obviously we're going to talk about Larry Coker from Miami and what he was able to do. Miami and UTSA, he got that program off the ground. But just really looking at Frank Solich, do you find it funny that it kind of seems like he kind of revitalized his career after leaving Nebraska? And perhaps, looking at Nebraska, y'all fired him way too early, especially when you look at over the years, the trouble that they've had with winning football games, whether it was Mike Riley, whether it was, the prodigal son, Scott Frost. Now they're going with Matt Rule. But to look at Solich, what he was able to do with the Ohio Bobcats, I think really solidified him as a Hall of Fame worthy head coach.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you look at, first of all, again, as we've talked about, taking over for Tom Osborne, replacing any legend is always hard to do. Taking over for Tom Osborne was always going to be hard. And, I think when you look at the way Nebraska's trajectory has gone since they got rid of Solich, and the way he established a level of consistency at Ohio in the MAC, which is a conference that I think is above all defined by consistency. There's no league with more parity. There's no league where it's harder to sustain success, and he still managed to do it. I'm not sure there's been a man in college football over the last few decades that's been more vindicated by time passing than Frank Solich.
I agree there. And then we have Larry Coker, a guy who inherited a very talented team, won a national championship. Has he done enough to prove that he's Hall of Fame worthy, though?
Yeah, this one's interesting. And I mean, I think my gut reaction to hearing it was probably pretty similar to what most people's was, which like, really? I mean, and to an extent, I get that. I mean, he comes in to Miami, it's a program that he did not build. He inherited an already very successful program. But, he does keep it rolling. He wins the national championship his first season. Doesn't win it his second year officially. Some people will still dispute that. But he does keep the success going. And I think it's worth noting that, he only had one season as things started to deteriorate down the stretch. He only had one season where they finished worse than 9-3. So it's not like the wheels completely fell off. But I think obviously the 60-15 record he finished with at Miami is a little bit misleading. And he does, I think, deserve a little bit of credit for, I think, is not often talked about second arc at UTSA, where he was, the program architect and didn't necessarily achieve the levels of success that we've seen in the past couple of years at UTSA. But, he still put a lot of the foundations for that program in place. So I think he deserves some credit for that. Whether he gets in, I would be personally a little bit surprised to see him get in, but we'll see.
We shall see. I mean, it wasn't like he did terrible at UTSA, building a new program. And winning 4 games his first year, I think is an accomplishment in itself. Now we're going to get into some baseball. We got the Super Regionals going on this weekend. I kind of want to talk about those series that I'm interested in seeing. I was looking forward to Texas versus Texas A&M, but much like basketball, Texas A&M goes out of their way to lose to avoid playing Texas before they join the SEC next year. Stanford, Texas, 2 teams that are known for national championships in baseball and trips to Omaha College World Series. I'm almost upset that this matchup is happening before Omaha, but if we have to have a really good Super Regional, I'm glad to see Texas versus Stanford, this weekend, winner going to Omaha.
Yeah, I mean, it all felt a little bit too good to be true, right? Didn't it? The idea of a Texas A&M Super just seemed like it wasn't quite in the cards. I mean, to me, I think, as an SEC guy, obviously, I'm a Florida grad and run an LSU website. I'm really intrigued by the pair of all SEC Super Regionals we've got this weekend. South Carolina heading to Gainesville to take on the Gators. And then we got Kentucky heading to heading to Baton Rouge to take on LSU. So obviously the SEC is guaranteed at least 2 spots in the College World Series, but a little bit tough to have, 2 of your better teams that hosted regionals have to go on the road to take on a conference foe in the Supers.
So let's dive into that as we wrap up the show. We're going to get into our predictions. We're going to start with the number 1 team in the country, Wake Forest, taking on Alabama. Does the Tide have a shot in this one?
I mean, look, I think it's really impressive the way Alabama closed the season out. I mean, look, we all know what happened with former coach Brad Bohannon was fired after he was, found to be in communication with someone. He was placing a bet on an Alabama baseball game. Long story short, new coach, interim coach finishing up the year. They end pretty strong, and hosting a regional in Tuscaloosa last weekend. A couple games got a little squirrely, but they end up going 3-0. They're advancing. Wake has been the most consistent team in the country all season. They looked the part last week, ran through their regional with no problems. I just don't think Alabama quite has the juice to take down a team as talented as Wake is in the Supers.
Yeah, and the next one we're going to talk about Stanford, Texas, and Palo Alto, California. Longhorns, kind of a team that, preseason top 25, top 10 team. Obviously, they lost Ivan Melendez, the Hispanic Titanic, the guy who did so fantastic for them last year. They kind of were under the radar for most of the season. After falling out, they kind of resurfaced, in the Big 12 tournament. And then obviously towards the end of the season, not a ranked team at this point, but they draw a very tall task in Stanford. My question is, I don't know that Texas has the firepower to win some shootouts if it gets into that, because as we know, Stanford can pour it on, and that's why I still think this series goes 3 games, but I think ultimately Stanford will win out there.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Now let's get into the team that you cover so well, LSU versus Kentucky. You got 2 guys who are expected to be top 3 picks when you talk about Skeens, the pitcher, and then one of my favorite players in the country, in Dylan Cruz. How do they match up with Kentucky? Obviously, there's a lot of familiarity being in the SEC, but is this one where Kentucky can give them a fight?
Yeah, so like you said, there is a lot of familiarity. These 2 teams played in Baton Rouge earlier in the season. LSU took 2 of 3. Granted, things have changed a little bit since then. LSU was the preseason number 1 team, but really ended the year on not the best stretch. Lost 2 of their last 3 regular season series. Had a bit of an early exit in the SEC tournament, and they entered on a bit of a slump. Looked really good last weekend in the Baton Rouge regional. Went 3-0. Cruz, who you talked about, had been on a bit of a slump to end the year. He went 8 of 13 over the weekend. He was phenomenal. This team's playing really good baseball right now. The bullpen, which had really been struggling down the stretch, was phenomenal. Kentucky got pushed to 7 games, had to win a decisive game against Indiana. Their offense was red hot over the weekend. I'm not sure that's going to be replicated on the road. I like LSU to pull that one out.
All right, then we have Tennessee, Southern Miss in Hattiesburg. Tennessee's a team that was highly touted coming into the season. What happened?
Yeah, it's just one of those things where, very talented team, obviously, one of the best pitchers in the country in Chase Dollander, but, it just didn't really work out as a lot of people thought it would. They're playing better baseball now, though, and they really impressed me last weekend, going to play a very good Clemson team, who's the number 4 national seed, beat them up at their regional, did it by coming back to win a game 6-5 in a 14-inning thriller. And then that was actually the only time they had to play Clemson all weekend. They're playing really good baseball right now, but they play a very tough mid-major program in Southern Miss, who has been on this stage before. They hosted a super regional in Hattiesburg last year, ultimately lost in 2 games to the eventual champions in Ole Miss. I'm really impressed with the run Southern Miss has made getting out of the Auburn regional. They lost an All-American pitcher in Hurston Waldrop to Florida after last season, still going back to the super regionals. This is a really good team, and probably the series I'm least confident in picking. But I think the way Tennessee's playing right now, I will pick them to pull it out on the road.
And let's keep it in the SEC as we run through these real quickly. Number 2, Florida. Number 18, South Carolina. Obviously, Florida's talented. It looked like they were going to run into some trouble with a talented Texas Tech team. They lost their first matchup, but they won the last 2 to win the regional. How do they match up with South Carolina, another team they're very familiar with?
Yeah, so sorry about Texas Tech, Patrick. But yeah, so Florida found itself in a pretty bad situation last weekend, had to ultimately win 3 games in a row. Got some really great starts out of bullpen guys in those 2 games against Texas Tech to ultimately move on. And they've got a really tough super regional draw here in a South Carolina team that swept them up in Columbia earlier this season. There's a time where the Gamecocks looked like they were maybe the best team in the country. Suffered some injuries down the stretch. They're getting a little bit healthier. Had a really good showing in a tough Columbia regional last weekend. They went 3-0. So they come into this one with a bit more momentum than the Gators do. But I do think I'm going to pick the high seed at home. Probably going to go 3 games that series. I'd be pretty surprised if either team was able to win it in 2. But I do think the home team will prevail. I think it's going to be a bit of a different result this time around in Gainesville.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one, but I definitely see it kind of that way, just because of the talent that Florida has. They've been here before. They've been to the World Series before. They've won national championships. It's hard for me to go against them. Now we're looking at the rest of the super regionals this weekend. We got an all ACC matchup. We got Virginia, Duke. They're very familiar. I think Duke's got the firepower, but I think Virginia's got the experience, and I think that's really valuable when you get this late in the season. Earlier in the year, you can win some games on talent alone. But when you got experienced guys who played in the College World Series a year ago, I have a hard time going against Virginia as that gets started in Charlottesville this weekend. How about the Oregon Oral Roberts? Oral Roberts, probably the best 4 seed in any regional.
Way underseeded.
Way underseeded. I'll agree with that. Oregon, they have a tough task, and I'm not convinced that they are going to be able to defend Eugene this weekend, going up against the Oral Roberts team, who's kind of taking some guys by surprise. I've got to pick a dark horse somewhere, so I'm going to go with the Oral Roberts here. I think that they're a team that they're talented. They can win a 3-game series and move on into head to Omaha. That's going to be a tough one. And then finally, we have Indiana State, the Sycamores, heading to Fort Worth, Texas to take on the TCU Horned Frogs, another team that is habitually competing for the College World Series, talented team out TCU, having to travel to Texas to play that. It's going to be a little hot, but I think the Frogs stand the heat, and they can fend off a very talented Indiana State Sycamores team for that. But that's going to do it for this week's The Initial College 12-pack. For Tyler, I'm Patrick, and we'll catch you next week as we're getting ready for the College World Series.